36.
Oh, sorry, apologies. Yes.
Well, it seems that we are being recorded.
Yes,
Does require by Article 36 that we should have a body that is able to be effective against corrupt activity. Now, we have not had a body of that kind, and there's been ongoing argument about it really for the last 20 years. Now, particularly since the coalition came into power in 2013, there have been a series of things happening that have raised serious questions about Australia's integrity. And I can deal with them at great length, but probably two are sufficient. They involve pork barrelling, but the complaints against the coalition really are much wider than pork barrelling. The first of them was before the previous election in May 2019, the coalition government had been spending a great deal of money on grants and programs. The sports program was set up in 2018 and involved $100 million, which was to go under a series of guidelines and merit criteria to deserving recipients. And a lot of people made applications for it. They came into the minister's office, who was Bridget McKenzie, and the list had been approved by the Sports Commission. And when it reached her office, it went straight into the waste paper basket, and in place of which a list was prepared on a board with coloured markings on it, which showed the marginal electorates. And $100 million was duly spent on marginal electorates and deserving electorates, which had been recommended by the Sports Commission, got nothing. Now, that was not discovered until after the May 2019 election. The Auditor General made a report which came out in January 2020 and which made it perfectly clear that Senator McKenzie's and her office had made the grants to people on the basis of the strength of the marginality of their electorates and largely to coalition electorates. And there was an absolute furor in Australia about this. The last time anything like this had happened was in the 1990s, when a Labor minister, Ros Kelly, had misbehaved in the same way for about 30 million. This was a much larger sum, 100 million, and Kelly had been chased out of cabinet and out of parliament by an angry Liberal Party. Now, this was the coalition being shown to have misbehaved so much, and the Prime Minister was cross-examined shortly afterwards in January 2020 in a national press club, where he was questioned by loads of reporters, to all of whom he gave arrogant and contemptuous responses along the line that she was doing what ministers are supposed to do, which is dispersing money in the public interest. And the community was extremely satisfied with what had happened. And that was then followed by a whole succession of his cabinet colleagues, from Peter Dutton on down, and Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, all saying the same thing. That was followed then by a Senate inquiry, which a number of the leading academic constitutional lawyers in Australia, including Anne Toomey, gave evidence of the extent to which this was all a breach of the rule of law. Now, can I tell you just quickly that the federal government in Australia does not have the right to spend money simply as it wants. And it has to have, the executive has to have statutory authority for spending. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's not entitled to engage in misspending of the sort of matter that's involved in pork barrelling. And thirdly, there is legislation, the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act, which provides the value for money requirements. And under that, the ministers are required, before they authorize spending of substantial amounts of money, to engage in reasonable inquiries to ensure that the spending is proper, and proper as defined as including efficient and ethical. Now, it was perfectly clear that for all those reasons, what was being done here was emphatically contrary to the law, and our academic commentators said it's quite plainly contrary to the rule of law. Now, all of this really faded into comparative insignificance when about a year later, another report by the Auditor General showed that the urban community fund had involved, again, before the May 2019 election, the spending of, on this time, nearly $800 million. And this was done to buy, or supposedly to provide the money for car parks. And they were coming at something like $20 million a car park. And they were, the way in which they were being organized was no investment guidelines, no merit criteria, no proper criteria at all. And the way in which they were allocated was by candidates, coalition candidates and members standing for re-election, simply ringing up the Prime Minister or Mr. Tudge, the city's minister, and saying, look, we're in a bit of trouble, we need a car park. And the result was that before the 2019 election, Josh Frydenberg, the treasurer in the Kooyong electorate, got the money provided for 4 car parks, $65 million worth. And Tim Wilson in Goldstein obviously was even more trouble. He got 6 car parks. Now, they were able, before the election, to go around to their electors and say, look what we've been able to get for you. And that was rampant, rank corruption. And again, it created an absolute furor. And by this time, there were really serious wonderings in the community about the extent to which this government was infected with corruption. It was also something which was very much in the mind of Transparency Australia, and Transparency's International Corruptions Index, which had shown Australia in 2012 at 7th position. By 2022, Australia had fallen to 18th on that list, a dramatic fall in 10 years, nearly all of which the coalition had been in place. And these examples of pork barrelling were only 2 examples of a number of serious matters that we were complaining about. Now, since then, the argument about a National Integrity Commission has been getting very strong. Those of us arguing for one have been asking for one with a broad jurisdiction, the ability for anyone to complain to it, that there should be public hearings and public reports. The coalition, for its part, didn't want public hearings or a broad jurisdiction. They were asking for a body, and that they put forward, the then Attorney General, Christian Porter, proposed a body without any particular detail given to it, which would have a jurisdiction which was in 2 separate halves. Half was going to law enforcement bodies, like the Australian Federal Police. This would have a wide jurisdiction. Anyone could complain to it. It would have public hearings and make public reports, including about corruption. That was for law enforcement bodies. But for the much larger section of the community, including politicians and the majority of the public service, an entirely different body was being proposed. This would have a jurisdiction limited to situations of it had to be a reasonable suspicion of a few criminal offences, a limited number of them. The average man in the street couldn't complain to it. To this half of the national body, one could only go to a body like the police and complain to them and suggest that you had reasonable suspicion of one of the relevant crimes. And unless you could persuade that body like the police that you did have a reasonable suspicion, your complaint went nowhere. There would be no public hearings by this body, and there would be no public reports at the end. They would only go to prosecutions if the director of public prosecution was convinced that there was an appropriate matter to take to a court, so that you'd only get to hear about it when the matter actually ended up in court years after the original complaint was made. And our argument has always been that corruption is much wider than criminality. It includes things like conflict of interest, includes things like pork barreling, and at the outset, there will never be, at that point, a reasonable suspicion of a crime. That's what the argument has been about. Now, the complaint about the public service is that while Morrison was in power, there was a body, the Thodey panel, investigating the public service, and which was recommending strongly that there should be the public service should be freed from the restrictions which were then in place and which prevented it from giving full and frank advice to ministers. Now, shortly, they were the consequence that the senior public servants were well paid, that they were in pretty good jobs, but they were also subject to immediate dismissal if they crossed the minister with whom they were advising. So the effect of which was when the Thodey panel recommendations came in 2019, they were intended to bring the public service back to a position of expert equality with politicians giving frank and fearless advice. Morrison didn't want any of that. He threw away those recommendations, and as was said by a number of members of the Thodey panel, he wanted public servants that were simply putting into effect the government's plans and proposals and not standing in the way of impropriety. That's been the principal problem for our public servants. Now, that's a very shortened version of the problem that we've had. We've now got a new government which has come in. Two things principally, I think, have led to a major change in voting at the last election in May of this year, a combination of very concerned attitudes on climate change, and the coalition was not good in dealing with climate change, and secondly, very strongly heightened concerns about the integrity of the last government. The new Labour government, the Albanese government, has promised to bring in a National Integrity Commission, and that is going to follow substantially the form that we have been pressing for, those of us who have been arguing for a proper National Integrity Commission. There are a couple of problems with it that I can deal with for you, if that would be a help, but that is my opening comments. I hope they're helpful.
Thanks. Thank you very much. That was just an amazing, much to learn from our end. We don't have a integrity commission or an anti-corruption commission here. We have a sort of bits and pieces network of the Serious Fraud Office and the Police Financial Intelligence Unit and some other regulated elements that deal with things. But yes, and so when you do see elements of possible misuse of funds, it's not necessarily well dealt with to take an integrity lens. It's more taking a legal well, very legal. I mean, maybe I don't know if you'd have any comment on that, because we're a small country, and you sort of think, do we need? Though there's been a question that's bounced around Transparency International New Zealand for quite a long time, not in depth, but I just wondered if you had any reflections on other countries, if you've seen them working in other similar jurisdictions to ours, which is not a federal system. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, yes, indeed. There are. There's a very large number of signatories to the UN Convention. It's well over 100. And there are plenty of places which do have integrity commissions set up. You can find the numbers on Google very quickly if you're interested. In Australia, the argument has been running for a long time as to why we didn't have a proper one, and the Commonwealth government, and both Labor and Coalition, neither were anxious to send one up, and both of them have been guilty of a variety of improprieties, most of all pork barrelling, for a long time. But the sort of argument that was being made in Australia, particularly out of the Attorney General's Department, was, look, we've got a lot of bodies that are here which are supposed to deal with and prevent corruption. Bodies like, in particular, one called ACLI, the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity. The difficulty with that was that it was a very ineffective body anyway, with a small budget and very few investigators, but it only dealt with law enforcement bodies. It never held public hearings, and it was generally regarded as hopelessly ineffective. And it was arguments which generally the government's reluctance to set up an integrity body was increasingly concerning bodies like Transparency. And when I questioned those in Transparency about the awful fall in Australia's rating, one of the matters, apart from the sports rorts and the car park rorts and things of that kind, was that we had not set up an integrity commission, which they regarded as a yawning gap in our integrity system. And that secondly, the body which had been proposed by the coalition, which wouldn't have been effective at discovering or exposing really any corruption among politicians at all. Now, I did look at New Zealand's position. I noted that you also were a member of UNCAC, and that you hadn't set up an integrity body, and I was wondering why, but at the same time, I really was in a very considerable difficulty in complaining about it, having regard to your position at number one in integrity matters on the CPI list. So maybe it's been thought so far you really didn't need one, and maybe Transparency agreed with that.
Maybe one of the other directors, would any of the directors like to have a comment or a question? I don't know, I can talk about that one. We've certainly got corruption. Adam, you got any comment? You're on mute, I think, Adam.
Oh, yeah, different box. Thanks very much. It was fascinating listening to you. I've got strong connections to Australia, so I've got to tell you, it's the first country I was ever asked for a bribe in. And so the next one was Indonesia. And I work with developing countries, so I work in this field. I'm speaking to you from Tashkent at the moment. Personally, I have had, for professional reasons, quite a lot of exposure to various forms of hard corruption. But in New Zealand, the thing that I struggle with most is observing what we refer to as soft corruption, and that's something we've discussed around the table quite a lot. It's a cultural phenomenon in a lot of countries, I think, where it's, especially the smaller the country, the harder it is, I think. My view is that we do need some form of clearly defined anti-corruption agency in New Zealand, mainly because of globalisation. It's,
Yeah.
you know, the world has changed over the last
Yeah.
few years, and I wondered if you had any comments on my thoughts.
Well, yes, most certainly. The sorts of matters outside the grey corruption in pork barrelling that are so much a problem, political donations are a very serious problem in Australia, and we have been arguing strongly for the introduction of proper legislation which would control donations down to a very low level. And the sorts of complaints we have are that the favour for favour argument, that a body that makes a large donation is obviously expecting something in return, otherwise it wouldn't give it. And so that that is the sort of thing which might be something in the nature of a concern. But the other is, I'm sorry to hear you got an offer of a bribe from Australia, but we had trouble, as I'm sure you heard, in relation to our submarines with the French naval group. And because we had a $90 billion contract with them, the procurement is an area where corruption is almost certainly rampant. Now, the French naval group is known to pay huge bribes in relation to Southeast Asian nations to get contracts to sell them. And just one example, they sold a number of frigates to Taiwan. The bribe they paid the French naval group to get that contract was, would you believe it, $500 million US. Now, just
You may notice I'm not looking very surprised.
you know, I can give you a number of examples of the bribes. The French come with very efficient negotiating teams and a very large wallet in their pockets, and that they are just simply one. Bribery, I think, in particularly in the area of defence, is rampant. But we in Australia had really Ackley was of no relevance in this area, and procurement, which covers all sorts of areas outside defence, and obviously health and matters of that kind, really had no effective guide against or guard against bribery of that kind. Now, they wouldn't have needed to spend money of that kind, but a few tens of millions spent here and there with the right people would have been an enormous advantage in getting the right word coming out of the Defence Department that that's the sort of thing we need, rather than Japan or Germany, who were the two other major options for us to get submarines from.
Thank you. That's a good. I completely agree that's one of my big concerns, is just the sheer scale of the money.
Yes.
When you transport that into a small economy like New Zealand, and you know, we forget that Australia, relatively speaking, is still a small economy.
Oh yes.
It's so disproportionate that I worry that we don't have the mechanisms to support people to resist it.
Yes. Yes. No, I agree.
Thank you.
We certainly didn't have them. I hope shortly we are going to have them. But one problem is that politicians naturally are not enthusiastic at all about public hearings. And there's a considerable fight taking place at the moment on that score.
I was going to ask you to comment on that. What do you I see civil society probably has a strong role. We should probably get the Honest Government ads guys to chip in as well, because they do a great job to try and garner support. Do you think there's something that needs to happen there?
Most emphatically, the Sydney, all of our states now, all 6 states and the territories, all have integrity bodies. The most well-known is the Sydney ICAC, Independent Commission Against Corruption, and that has a fairly easy ability to have a public hearing, which is based upon public interest in there being one. Victoria is probably the next most important, and that has a very serious limitation on the ability to have a public hearing, which is that there must be exceptional circumstances. Now, it's very difficult to define exceptional, and there's an ability to go to a court if you think that there are not exceptional circumstances and you're being investigated. And the result is that whereas in the last, say, 8 years, the ICAC's had about 40 public hearings, Victoria has only had 8. And our commissioner in Victoria, Robert Redlich, has been complaining bitterly that it's a serious limitation on the ability to public hearings, and he and the Sydney commissioner both strongly urge that the body must have the right to hold public hearings for a variety of reasons, which I can give you at length if you want to hear them, but you may not need to. The principal argument against them is that they allegedly damage people's reputations. They certainly can do that, and there must be careful protections put in to make sure that the ability to hold public hearings is not misused.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, with your background, it reminds me a little of the arguments in court about suppressing the identity of the accused. We allow that a lot in New Zealand. I'm still surprised by how often it happens here. So it sounds like it, which is, let's keep it secret until we actually know. And I can see the argument, but surely that I would have thought that the basic principle, it should be transparent unless there's a good reason not to, which is similar to the court basis, should apply.
Yeah, I agree. We don't often have the accused names being kept hidden. The names of particularly victims in rape cases are kept hidden usually, but the accused usually will be well and truly known. Only in very few cases are trials completely in secret, and sometimes, but even with people like the Bernard Collaery and Witness K, another example of Australia's appalling behaviour in relation to East Timor, where ASIS, our MI6 type agents, bugged the Timorese cabinet room so that Australia would be able to hear what the Timorese were saying in cabinet about the negotiations, and which came through to our negotiators, enabling us to get a very good treaty against the Timorese until all this was uprooted when Witness K, the ASIS agent in charge, told Bernard Collaery, who became the solicitor, and they took the matter to the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague. Since then, the situation has been righted, but over the best part of 10 years, Australia stole billions of dollars from the Timorese, our closest neighbour and poorest neighbour, and imagine the impact on Australia's reputation overseas, no doubt in New Zealand, and in the South Pacific generally.
I've monopolised you, sorry. Do any of my fellow directors or anybody else have any questions or comments?
I've got...
Just Peter Kelly, I used to be in the Defence Force. In my previous role, I was the Chief of Army, and I have served in East Timor. That was appalling, that example you raised, and given that, you know, the Australian government with good intentions went in there for the right reasons to stop the militia and the Indonesians and that sort of stuff. Yes. And you know, that was, they lost a lot of moral high ground over that, for sure.
I don't think there was any left.
No, it's appalling.
do you have to, what is your time? I'm not sure if there are other questions, but I'm also conscious that you may not have had dinner yet.
Look, I'm in no hurry. I'm available to you as long as you want. I should say that one of the things I've got to produce tomorrow is a copy of the submissions made by Transparency Australia to the Senate Commission into the car parks rorts, which I think is an absolutely marvellous submission signed by Serena Lillywhite, which sets out Transparency's view as to where Australian pork barrelling was going so terribly wrong and the steps needed to be taken by the public service to stop it, which I will give you tomorrow.
Thank you. Yes, that'd be excellent. Yes, I think they've been extremely active and vocal on a number of issues of national importance, and they've raised it at a very high level. And you can see that this is. I think they've made that contribution to the outcome as well. I think, yeah.
I think they've contributed very strongly to the very serious drop in the view of the community in Australia towards the lack of integrity of the previous government. Everyone is hoping that the new government will produce a very breath of cold fresh air in Canberra to clean a lot of it away, and the interesting arrival of a large number of independents winning seats away from the coalition as well, which I think is a very significant change in the makeup of our parliament.
Has anybody else got a question or a comment that they'd like to make?
Would anybody else on the board, Brendan Wilson, Deputy Chair, would anybody else in the New Zealand contingent like to comment on any of our own considerations towards the setup of a similar commission in New Zealand? What have we talked through and considered? Has it been raised much? I'm not aware of it.
It has been raised a few times, and there was a great TV program on TV1 last night about fraud and how much the public in New Zealand are facing fraud generally, and that it's really not being dealt with sufficiently, white collar fraud in particular. It's not getting the same amount of criminalisation, but it's also just often not getting the level of investigation that's needed, and people aren't getting the level of support, and that there are areas which are just being dropped away as people get ripped off. And I think that's one sort of, clearly there are gaps, but there's clearly gaps because people are not getting are being defrauded a great deal, and there just doesn't seem to be enough happening apart from a one-off case of it. Yeah, so maybe it's a slightly different issue than the kind of pork barrelling that has happened in Australia.
I think there's a related element to that. So I worked in financial regulators of various descriptions, and if you walk into we used to have the public come in and say, I've been to the police and they won't do anything because they say it's a civil matter. That's the standard response. And that's correct in, technically, but I do think that's a gap in New Zealand. But there's a corruption element to this, which is if you go to the police to report corruption, you often get a very similar response because they simply don't know what to do with it.
Yes, exactly.
And there's also a chunk of what I think of as a form of self-censorship amongst public servants who, I've seen this over the years where my staff used to say, oh, we won't go near that because insert name of public figure here is involved and it will get difficult. And if who used to say, well, that's all the more reason to look at it, so let's get on with it. But
we had in Victoria, it was a long time before it followed the New South Wales ICAC. ICAC was set up in 1988, but in 2010 we still did not have one, and I'd been with others who had been strongly arguing for one, but the Labour governments in the first decade of this century kept rejecting one, saying we simply do not need one in Victoria. There's no corruption here. Now, when Ted Baillieu won office in 2011, he promised an electoral commission based on the Sydney ICAC, and the body which he in fact produced was a hopeless sham, but it was intended to fail. But it did start an investigation, and its first public investigation was of the Education Department, which rapidly disclosed that there were millions of dollars being, very large sums being creamed off Victoria's education budget by a group of very senior people in the Education Department. And Victorians became aware for the first time that there was a serious problem of corruption in Victoria, ignoring all sorts of other things, such as that Victoria was regarded as the drug capital of the Southern Hemisphere, and that there was a major turf war going on between drug gangs in Melbourne. Mm. Equally...
Sorry, that was why I laughed when you said there was no need in Victoria.
Yeah. And equally, in South Australia now, they have no effective integrity commission. They have a body, but they have torn away so much of its power that it's quite ineffective, and they're working on the same basis, that there is no corruption in South Australia. Well, corruption follows money, power and influence, and governments where it's to be found, and most of all in Australia, in the federal government.
It does strike me that in New Zealand we have a significant gap between what the SFO and the Auditor General and maybe some other agencies might be prepared to grapple with. None of them have a very solid entry point for significant doubts or concerns to be taken. And it does make me wonder whether in New Zealand, Transparency International New Zealand should be thinking harder about pushing for an anti-corruption body commission of some nature.
Perhaps, Brendan, this is, when you're looking at our functions elements that we're looking at the National Integrity System Assessment, perhaps this is something that, should be talked about a bit more, because, as part of that, maybe, is it, what do you think, John? Is that the sort of gaps, where the gaps are in our anti-corruption, in generally across our anti-corruption systems?
Well, I think there's it certainly does merit some questions, but that it'll be interesting to see what we come up with, Julie, and with alongside Anne, and as to how that can be done.
We've had people saying in Australia, well, the Auditor General has exposed the misbehaviour of the coalition government in relation to the sports rorts and the car park rorts, and so why do we need a national integrity body? He's doing the job. The trouble is that the Auditor General is principally an accountant, and his staff usually aren't trained in investigation of corruption, and don't usually also have the budget to be able to do that. Now, while the coalition government was spending so frankly on these grants and programs that were contrary to the rule of law, we've only more recently discovered that in the 4 years Morrison was Prime Minister, the Auditor General exposed amounts of something like $1 billion that had been misspent. In fact, the government was spending on these grants and programs something like $55 billion. I'm not saying that all of that was wrong, but every every grant or program of that kind he's looked at has been shown so far to have been tilted in the direction of marginal electorates.
If I may ask a question, actually, Your Honour,
Stephen, please.
Stephen, sorry. How do you, when you're investigating corruption, and maybe I should know the answer to this question, but how do you establish the link between a pattern of where the funds are distributed and intent to influence something through how they're distributed?
Look, that really is a very important question, because when we are looking in the context of pork barrelling, that's misspent government money. It is only, well, let me say this. When people spend government money, they will usually have a variety of motives, and some of them may be entirely proper. People who want a road or a dam or matters of that kind, there'll be a variety of very good public reasons for it. And it is only after detailed investigation that you're going to be able to find whether something has gone wrong. When they were investigating the sports frauds, the 100 million in that particular program, people at first thought that there was nothing obviously wrong about it. No one in the public, from 2018, when the program started, until May 2019, when the election occurred, no one thought that there was anything necessarily wrong with the sports program. Someone, and I think it was Mark Dreyfus, the then Shadow Attorney General, asked the Auditor General to investigate it. And the Auditor General spent a very long time, thousands of hours, to produce a report which didn't come out until January of 2020, 7 or 8 months after the election. It was only then that people became aware of how $100 million had been grossly misspent and corruptly misspent. And by putting together all of the information which showed first that there had been a proper process engaged in by the Sports Commission, producing a list of recommended bodies to receive the spending, and then learning that was turfed away by Senator Bridget McCormack, and followed by the collection of bodies to which the money was being spent, which time and again on investigation showed that there'd been no proper investigation by the Minister's office of the necessity for money to be given, say, as was the fact, $500,000 in Tony Abbott's electorate to the Mosman Rowing Club, a very wealthy body, to improve their pontoons. Now, as opposed to the sorts of bodies which were recommended for money, First Nations groups in the Northern Territory who are trying to play football on gravel playing fields, things of that kind. Now, that required detailed investigation before you got there. Now, the sorts of things that happen with public donations is there'll be plenty of people who will be prepared to whisper to a body that there's been a very large donation that's come in from some major fossil fuel company, followed by a great deal of lobbying, leading to a decision being made in government that was beneficial to that company. But it will depend upon people being prepared to make complaints, and when the body is set up, there will be tens of thousands of complaints coming in, of which about 0.5 of 1% will be worth investigating. And one major question people are asking is about retrospectivity. Of course, retrospectivity will be there. What you cannot do is change the law retrospectively, but just as police usually investigate matters retrospectively, that they're looking at what's happened in the past, so also it would be entirely appropriate for the body to look at what's happened in the past and also to receive complaints from people. And people who are working in government departments are often ready to make complaints about things that are not being done properly. There were a very large number of complaints, for example, about the Defence Department.
If I could ask a follow-up question as well there, Stephen, once you've identified that money has been corruptly distributed to somebody, I guess there might be situations where, and the sports grants might be a good example of this, some of the organisations might not have intended that their application would be improperly favoured.
Yes, no, I'm sure it may well have come as a nasty surprise to some to know that that they were regarded as having received money improperly. But usually, it's impossible to get the money back.
Yes.
One of the difficulties about about dealing with that is finding potential plaintiffs that have standing to challenge matters of that kind. There are some High Court decisions in which people have finally gone to the High Court saying that this money is being improperly spent, and you should make decisions in that case. The difficulty with getting a plaintiff is that they have to be prepared to take the Commonwealth on in the High Court, and if they lose, the cost of losing will be in the hundreds of thousands. So that a major problem is getting plaintiffs who are prepared to get up and complain. You've got to find a state attorney general who's prepared to take on the Commonwealth.
Yes, and I mean, that might be difficult in a country like New Zealand where we don't have a federal system. But the other question I was going to ask is, when you've identified, when you get to that stage, what's the remedy that you look for? Do you look for a disgorging of the profits? Do you look for an account of profits?
Theoretically, if you establish that spending by a government was improper and wrong, then the people who were responsible for that can be forced to repay the money. Now, very rarely does that ever happen. The important thing that happen is that if the High Court says no, that cannot happen, and that the two cases I'm thinking of were the Williams, the school chaplain cases, where a particular man called Williams was not prepared to have his child at a school where chaplains were being of a particular kind were being funded by the Commonwealth. Now that was declared improper, and the Commonwealth then found other ways of providing the money for it. But in relation to things like the sports rorts, no one has ever suggested that the bodies which actually received the money wrongly should have to hand it back. What happened was the disclosure of the fact. The Commonwealth and the Cabinet then got an enormous amount of very bad egg on their faces, and their integrity began to drop dramatically with the community. This all happened back in early 2020, and those of us who were so concerned about it were very anxious that the community should be reminded at the time of the 2022 election that had taken place and that government had acted so improperly. I'm a non-partisan in these things electorally, and what I was doing was wanting a National Integrity Commission because I thought both sides of Parliament were prepared to act repeatedly improperly, and there should be means in the form of an Integrity Commission to stop it.
Thank you.
A fascinating discussion. I've yet to hear any comment that would lead me to thinking that we don't need something like this in New Zealand. However, that's for further discussion locally and a lot of more expert minds than mine. I'm sorry that we don't have either Anne Tolley or Anne Webster here at the moment on the call to ask further questions, because I think they both have some really interesting points to to ask about. Julie, is there any other things that we would like to put before Stephen, or any other of the people present like to put any other points?
If Anne, is it Anne Toomey, the Sydney Constitutional Law Professor you're talking about?
No, it's Anne Tolley. She's our chair,
Oh, right.
and an
Yeah.
ex-cabinet minister. So she's
Right.
she's got years of political experience, and
Yes.
she's unfortunately over in India at the moment. But she
Right.
that's why I've recorded it. She said, "Please, can you keep the recording and can I watch it afterwards?" So she's really keen. Sorry.
Oh, Julie, if I may, I've just had a follow-up thought. Sorry, Stephen.
Not at all.
A little bit of a practical question. In Australia, how does the anti-corruption body work alongside, and how do you differentiate or demarcate roles against the Commonwealth Ombudsman?
The Ombudsman is looking basically at maladministration, where and the Ombudsman had a great deal to do with the publicising of the robo-debt problems, where people were, I don't know if you've heard of the robo-debt scheme, but it was being alleged that thousands of people had received amounts wrongly in payments from the Commonwealth, and that it was that they then decided, well, we'll get it back, and that they did this by computer, that there was no legal or proper means of doing it. So the scheme was totally illegal, and most people were being pursued by this on incorrect amounts, some of whom owned nothing, that there were a number of suicides. But the Ombudsman was a very significant part in dealing with this maladministration. The Ombudsman in Victoria works, Deborah Glass, does a terrific job again in maladministration. Robert Redlich is the IBAC commissioner, and they have done a number of investigations together in relation to matters, that they have a means of, if a complaint comes to one that Redlich thinks would be more appropriately dealt with as maladministration by Deborah Glass, he refers it to her, and vice versa. If she sees something which she thinks is properly corruption and an IBAC matter, she will refer that across.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Brendan, I think it might be time for us to call it to halt. I know that tomorrow, Stephen, you're talking to the chief executives in similar line, I think, and
Yes.
And I think that'll be a rich discussion as well. But I thank you, and maybe ask Brendan to thank you on behalf of the board for.
Well, thank you, Julie, and particularly thank you, Stephen. Absolutely compelling, and talk about food for thought. You gave a lot of cases of Australia's woes, and for anyone in New Zealand to think that we don't have our own woes in some way would be absolutely dreaming. So I wish you well for the discussion that you will have tomorrow. I know that you'll have a really attentive audience who will be equally interested as we are. But in the meantime, many, many thanks both for all your work, which is such a valuable and important contribution, but also to you for talking to us and putting time in tonight. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. A pleasure.
Good.